The doors of the Fairfield County Courthouse opened, and the sound of Sergeant Thomas Reed's steady steps echoed through the room. Holding the leash of his partner, Coda, a German shepherd with impeccable posture, Thomas moved confidently. Guided by the loyal dog at his side, the room fell silent as people noticed that the officer was blind. But more than curiosity, the air was filled with murmurs of doubt and disbelief. Judge Allen Hensley, known for his sharp tongue and biting humor, wasted no time. "Well, this is unusual. Let me guess. The dog writes the reports?" His laughter filled the room, prompting nervous chuckles from some. Thomas remained composed, his grip on Coda's leash tightening slightly. Coda let out a single commanding bark that echoed through the courtroom, silencing the whispers. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice steady. "Coda and I rescued a 7-year-old child from an armed ambush last week. If you'd like, I can explain how we did it instead of debating who writes my reports." His tone was firm and unwavering. Sensing the rising tension, Prosecutor Sarah Blake stepped in. "Sergeant Reed, please tell us what happened that night. I believe everyone here could learn something from your bravery." As Thomas recounted the events, the courtroom grew still. He described how Coda tracked clues in the chaos of the scene, while Thomas listened intently to every sound around him, trusting his partner completely. The story revealed a bond of absolute trust and courage that went far beyond the limits of physical sight. Even the skeptics seemed moved by the harrowing details. But Judge Hensley wasn't ready to let go of his usual sarcasm. "A nice story," he said, leaning forward. "But tell me this. How does a blind man shoot a criminal without missing? Or did the dog handle that part too?" Thomas tightened his hold on Coda's leash, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Courage, Your Honor, doesn't require sight. It only takes heart." Coda barked again, this time a low, resolute sound that cut through the tension. The judge paused, caught off guard for a moment. His expression softened, but it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. As Thomas left the courtroom, guided by Coda's steady movements, he could feel the weight of the battle ahead. Respect wasn't won in a single day, and he knew this was just the beginning of proving himself to those who refused to see beyond his disability. But as always, Coda was by his side, ready for whatever came next. Are you enjoying this amazing story? Don't forget to give it a like to support the channel and help these inspiring stories reach more people. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Your support is essential for us to keep sharing stories like this. Thomas descended the courthouse steps, Coda's steady guidance, keeping his path straight. The crisp winter air bit at his face, but the sting of Judge Hensley's words lingered far longer. The sarcastic tone, the snickers in the courtroom. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such doubt, but it never got easier. Coda, always attuned to his partner's emotions, slowed his pace, pressing gently against Thomas's leg. "Not everyone sees it, huh, Coda?" Thomas muttered, a trace of bitterness in his voice. The dog gave a soft whine in response, his ears flicking back as if he understood every word. Thomas reached down, brushing his fingers through Coda's fur. "It's all right, buddy. We've been through worse." But deep down, Thomas couldn't shake the judge's dismissive attitude and the unspoken challenge it carried. "Sergeant Reed," a voice broke through his thoughts. Turning his head slightly, Thomas recognized the confident tone of Sarah Blake, the prosecutor. Her quick steps echoed on the pavement as she caught up. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, her breath visible in the cold air. Thomas stopped, Coda standing alert at his side. "I'm guessing you're not here to tell me Hensley's suddenly a fan," Thomas said dryly. Sarah gave a small chuckle. "Not quite," she replied. "But I do want to say what you did in there was impressive. The way you stood your ground. It takes guts." She paused, her tone softening. "But you know Hensley's not done with you. He's going to push, and he won't stop until he finds a crack." Thomas let out a slow breath. "He can push all he wants. I've spent my entire career proving myself to people who see the badge before the man, the blindness before the skill." He adjusted his grip on Coda's leash, the subtle movement a sign of his resolve. "Hensley's just another obstacle, and I don't back down from obstacles." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. I believe you, she said quietly. But just so you know, if you need someone in your corner, I'm here for you and Coda. Her words were genuine, and Thomas nodded in appreciation, though his guard remained up. As Thomas and Coda turned to leave, Sarah stayed rooted to the spot, watching them disappear into the cold. There was something about the pair, a quiet strength that demanded respect, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Hensley had something in mind, and it wasn't going to be a fair fight. This was far from over. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the precinct, Coda trotting confidently by his side. The familiar sounds of ringing phones and hurried footsteps greeted them as they entered, but something was different. Conversations quieted as Thomas passed, and he could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Coda's ears flicked, picking up on the unease around them, and he pressed closer to Thomas's leg. "Morning, Reed," said Captain Harris, his voice unusually neutral. Thomas could hear the hesitation behind the words. "Judge Hensley called me last night. He's requested you to testify in an ongoing case he's presiding over, a high-profile one." Thomas frowned, gripping Coda's leash tighter. "What case?" Harris hesitated before answering. "It's the Santiago trial, organized crime. You and Coda worked on that case a few months ago, tracked their money laundering operations. Hensley wants you to testify about your involvement in locating key evidence." Thomas nodded slowly, but Harris continued, his tone more serious. "Reed, you should know this isn't just about the case. Hensley's testing you. He thinks putting you on the stand will expose your limitations." Thomas's jaw tightened. He could feel the familiar surge of frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "So he's making it personal." Thomas muttered more to himself than to Harris. "Fine. If he wants to test me, I'll show him what Coda and I are capable of." Coda barked once, a sharp, confident sound as if agreeing with his partner's resolve. "Look, Reed," Harris said, lowering his voice. "I know you've got nothing to prove to anyone here, but Hensley's not just stubborn. He's calculated. He'll try to trip you up, maybe even discredit you. Just be ready." Thomas nodded, a determined set to his features. "I always am." As Thomas walked away, the room seemed heavier than before. The eyes of his colleagues followed him and Coda. He knew what they were thinking: doubt, curiosity, admiration perhaps, but none of it mattered. The only opinion he cared about was the one he carried within himself. With his partner at his side, Thomas felt unstoppable, but even he couldn't ignore the quiet warning in Harris's words. Hensley was waiting, and this time the stakes were higher. Thomas entered the bustling courtroom with Coda at his side. The air buzzed with tension. This wasn't just another trial. It was one of the biggest cases in years. The Santiago crime syndicate was notorious for their ruthlessness, and Thomas's work with Coda had been pivotal in uncovering evidence that led to the indictment. But he knew this trial wasn't just about justice. It was Hensley's stage, and Thomas was the main act. Judge Hensley sat at the bench, his expression unreadable, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement maybe. Thomas stood in the center of the room, Coda at attention by his side. The room was packed with lawyers, jurors, and spectators, their eyes darting between the blind officer and his K9. Hensley tapped his gavel lightly. "Sergeant Reed, please approach the witness stand, and don't worry, we'll find a spot for your partner." The remark earned a few quiet laughs, but Thomas didn't flinch. Coda stayed calm, his steady presence grounding Thomas as he walked confidently to the stand. Sarah Blake, seated with the prosecution team, watched with a mixture of concern and pride. She could see the subtle smirk tugging at the corner of Hensley's lips and knew this was going to be more than just testimony. It was a calculated attempt to undermine Thomas. As Thomas took his seat, Coda sat at his feet, his ears alert. The cross-examination began, and the defense attorney wasted no time. "Sergeant Reed," the man said, his tone sharp, "you claim that your dog, Coda, tracked the evidence that led to this trial, but how can you verify what he found, given your condition?" The word condition hung in the air like a veiled insult. Thomas straightened. "Coda is trained to alert me when he detects a target. His signals are clear and precise. I don't need to see to understand his cues. It's called trust and teamwork." The defense attorney pressed further, his voice dripping with skepticism. And yet, without sight, how can you confirm that your teamwork didn't lead to mistakes? Aren't you just relying on instinct and luck? The room grew tense, all eyes fixed on Thomas. He paused for a moment, letting the question linger. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but resolute. Instinct and luck don't save lives. Training, discipline, and a bond built on trust do. Kota and I have been through situations most people can't imagine. We've proven ourselves time and time again, and this case is no different. The evidence speaks for itself. As his words echoed in the silent courtroom, Kota barked once, sharp and commanding, as if to say he agreed. Even Hensley's smirk faltered, but Thomas knew the judge wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, Thomas arrived back at the courthouse with Kota. The weight of the previous day's grilling still heavy on his mind. He had held his ground against the defense attorney, but he knew Judge Hensley wasn't satisfied. As Thomas entered the courtroom, he felt a strange energy in the air, a sense that something unexpected was coming. Kota, ever perceptive, let out a low rumble of unease, his body tensing against Thomas's leg. "All rise," the bailiff called as Hensley entered. The judge took his seat, his eyes landing on Thomas, with a look that sent a clear message. Today was going to be different. As everyone sat, Hensley leaned forward, speaking with a deliberate tone. "Before we proceed with the trial, I'd like to conduct a short demonstration. Sergeant Reed, I'd like to test the reliability of your partnership with Kota." Thomas's shoulders stiffened. A demonstration? He hadn't been warned about this. He felt the room shift as whispers spread among the spectators. Sarah Blake stood immediately, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular." "Overruled," Hensley interrupted, his tone clipped. "If Sergeant Reed's testimony hinges on the abilities of his K-9, then it's only fair to confirm those abilities in this courtroom." He turned to Thomas, his eyes narrowing. "I assume you have no objection, Sergeant." Thomas could feel the trap closing, but he refused to back down. "None, Your Honor." His voice was steady, though his pulse quickened. Kota pressed closer to him, sensing the shift in tension. Whatever Hensley had planned, Thomas knew he and Kota would face it together. The bailiff stepped forward, holding a small satchel in his hands. "This contains a decoy scent," he announced. "We've placed it somewhere in this courtroom. Let's see if Kota can locate it." The challenge wasn't unreasonable. Kota had performed similar tasks countless times, but the stakes felt different. With every eye in the room watching, waiting for a mistake, Thomas knelt beside Kota, running his hand over the dog's head. "All right, buddy. You know what to do." With a simple command, Kota sprang into action, weaving through the room with his nose low to the ground. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the soft clicking of Kota's claws against the floor. Thomas stood still, trusting completely in his partner, but in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Why did this feel like more than just a test? What do you think about this unexpected moment in the courtroom? Do you believe the judge is being fair by requesting this demonstration, or is it a way to put extra pressure on Thomas and Kota? Share your thoughts in the comments below. All eyes were on Kota as he moved methodically through the courtroom, his nose sweeping low to the ground. The spectators leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the scene unfolding before them. Judge Hensley sat back with a smug expression, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench. Thomas, standing still, felt the weight of the moment. He couldn't see Kota's movements, but he could hear them, soft, deliberate, purposeful. "Take your time, Kota," Thomas murmured under his breath. His partner wasn't just searching for a scent. He was carrying the burden of proving their bond to a room full of doubters. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as Kota worked. Suddenly, Kota stopped near the back of the room. He froze, his ears pricking forward, then barked sharply once. The sound echoed off the walls, startling a few spectators. He nosed the corner of a table, pawing lightly at it before turning to face Thomas. His tail wagged with certainty. "Good boy," Thomas said with quiet pride. The bailiff approached the spot where Kota had stopped, crouching down and reaching beneath the table. A moment later, he held up the satchel for everyone to see. "He's got it," the bailiff confirmed. A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and Thomas could sense the subtle shift in energy. People were impressed, even if they didn't say it aloud. "Impressive," Judge Hensley said, though his tone was begrudging. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "But let's not forget, Sergeant Reed, that this was a controlled environment. Out in the field, things are much less predictable. Mistakes are costly, aren't they?" The words hung in the air, and Thomas knew what Hensley was doing, trying to plant doubt, making everyone question whether he could handle real danger. Thomas stood taller, his hand resting on Coda's head. "Mistakes are costly, Your Honor. That's why Coda and I train every day to make sure they don't happen. We've been in situations far more chaotic than this courtroom, and we've never failed each other." His voice was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. Coda let out a low, approving growl as if backing his partner's words. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but for the first time, Judge Hensley seemed at a loss for a response. The battle wasn't over, but Thomas had just won this round. Thomas exited the courthouse with Coda by his side, the crisp winter air filling his lungs as he tried to shake off the tension of the day. The demonstration had gone exactly as he'd expected. Coda had proven his skill flawlessly, but the satisfaction of the victory was short-lived. Hensley's words still echoed in his mind, carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. Out in the field, things are much less predictable. Thomas knew that wasn't just a comment, it was a challenge. As Thomas and Coda headed toward the parking lot, Sarah Blake caught up with them, her hurried steps crunching against the gravel. "Thomas," she called, her tone sharp but concerned. "Wait a second." He paused, turning slightly toward her voice. "You know what Hensley's doing, don't you?" Thomas nodded, his expression calm, but his jaw tight. "Yeah, he's testing me. Tried to make me crack in front of everyone. The demonstration wasn't about Coda, it was about me. He wants me to fail." Sarah folded her arms, her eyes narrowing as she glanced back toward the courthouse. "He's not done with you, Thomas. I've seen him pull stunts like this before. He's going to push until he finds something to use against you, whether it's in this case or the next. He doesn't believe someone like you belongs in the field, and he'll do whatever it takes to prove that." Thomas sighed, running a hand over Coda's head. "Then let him try," he said firmly. "I've spent my whole career proving people like him wrong. I won't stop now." He gave Coda's leash a slight tug, signaling it was time to move. But as they walked away, Sarah's words stayed with him. She was right, Hensley wasn't done. Later that evening, as Thomas sat in the quiet of his small apartment, Coda lying at his feet, his phone buzzed on the table. Picking it up, he heard Captain Harris's familiar voice on the other end. "Reed, we've got a new development on the Santiago case," Harris said. "One of their top guys is talking, but there's a catch. They want you and Coda to lead the raid, to retrieve the remaining evidence tomorrow night. You in?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "We're in," he said. But as he hung up the phone, he couldn't help but think of Hensley. Would this be the unpredictable chaos the judge had warned about? Would this raid be his chance to prove his worth, or the perfect storm? Hensley was waiting. The cold wind whipped against Thomas's face as he stood outside the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The Santiago Syndicate's remaining operation was rumored to be inside, along with the evidence needed to dismantle their network for good. Thomas gripped Coda's leash tightly, feeling the tension in the air around him. The SWAT team murmured in low voices, checking their gear and preparing for the raid. Coda stood alert at his side, his ears perked and eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "Reed," Captain Harris said, stepping up to him. "You and Coda will lead the team in. We've got reports of armed guards inside, so stay sharp. If this gets messy, pull back and let us handle it." Harris's voice was calm but firm, and Thomas could tell the captain was worried. He knew the risks, but there was no room for doubt. Thomas crouched down beside Coda, running a hand over his partner's head. "You ready, buddy?" Coda let out a low growl, his muscles tensing in anticipation. "All right then, let's do this." As Thomas stood, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This wasn't just a mission. It was his chance to prove once again that he and Coda were more than capable. The team moved in, the crunch of their boots muffled by the soft dirt. Thomas led the way, Coda guiding him with precision through the maze of crates and machinery that littered the warehouse floor. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rust, but Coda's nose was focused, searching for something more dangerous. Suddenly, Coda froze, his body stiffening as he let out a quiet whine. "What is it, Coda?" Thomas whispered, his hand tightening on the leash. Coda's head tilted toward a stack of crates, and Thomas signaled for the team to stop. He could hear faint voices on the other side, followed by the distinct click of a gun being loaded. The tension in the air was palpable. "We've got movement," Thomas said softly into his radio. "Stay low and be ready." As the team spread out, Coda began to growl, a warning, low but unmistakable. The voices grew louder, and Thomas knew they were out of time. "Go," he ordered, releasing Coda's leash. The dog shot forward like a bullet, disappearing into the shadows. The warehouse erupted into chaos as shouts and gunfire rang out. Thomas moved quickly, his focus razor-sharp, trusting Coda to do what he did best. This was the unpredictable moment Judge Hensley had warned about, but Thomas didn't care. He and Coda were ready. The warehouse was a blur of noise and motion, every sound amplified in Thomas's mind. He could hear the rapid footsteps of the SWAT team spreading out, the sharp cracks of gunfire cutting through the air, and the echo of shouted commands. But his focus was on Coda. Somewhere in the chaos, his partner was doing what he was trained to do: tracking, disarming, protecting. Every instinct told Thomas to follow Coda, but he couldn't see him. All he had was trust. "Coda," Thomas called, his voice firm despite the chaos. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved forward, his hand brushing along the cold, sharp edges of stacked crates. He strained to hear over the noise, until finally, a sharp bark rang out, cutting through everything else. Coda's signal. Thomas's grip tightened on his weapon as he turned toward the sound, moving with precision and confidence. The bark came again, closer this time, followed by the muffled sound of a scuffle, then a loud crash reverberating through the space. Thomas picked up his pace, his pulse racing. "Coda, I'm coming," he shouted. When he rounded a corner, the scene unfolded like something out of a nightmare. A man lay pinned on the ground, Coda's jaws clamped tightly on his arm. A discarded weapon lay inches from the man's free hand, and he was frantically trying to reach it. "Coda, hold," Thomas commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The dog froze, his teeth still gripping the man's arm, but his body stiff and alert, waiting for further instructions. Thomas moved quickly, kicking the weapon out of reach and securing the suspect with zip ties. "Good boy," he murmured, his hand brushing over Coda's head briefly before turning his attention back to the sounds of the ongoing raid. "Reed, we've got a problem." Captain Harris's voice crackled through the radio. "There's a secondary room, heavily barricaded. We think that's where the main stash is. Can you and Coda clear the path?" Thomas exhaled sharply, his body still humming with tension. "We're on it," he replied. He could feel Coda's energy radiating beside him, ready for the next challenge. As they moved toward the barricaded area, Thomas couldn't help but think of Judge Hensley's words, the doubt laced into every comment. This was the moment to prove him wrong. But more than that, it was a moment to show the world that he and Coda were unstoppable, even in the face of chaos. Thomas crouched low, Coda at his side, as they approached the barricaded room. The muffled voices of men inside drifted through the thick walls, and the faint metallic clatter of weapons being loaded sent a chill through the air. Behind him, the SWAT team waited for the signal, their breath visible in the cold. But Thomas knew this was on him and Coda, breaking through, clearing the path, and proving once again that they were more than capable. "Coda, search," Thomas whispered, releasing his partner. The German shepherd moved with fluid precision, his nose to the ground and his ears twitching at every sound. Within seconds, Coda stopped and turned back toward Thomas, signaling with a soft bark. He'd found something, a weak point in the barricade. "Good boy," Thomas muttered, reaching out to feel the edge of the metal crate blocking the door. Using Coda's guidance, Thomas placed his hand on a narrow gap. He could feel the faint draft of air leaking through, and the sound of movement on the other side grew louder. "They're in there," he whispered into his radio. "3, maybe 4. He tightened his grip on his weapon, then gave the command, "Coda, back." The dog retreated, his body low and ready. "Breaching in 32. Thomas called. The door exploded inward as the SWAT team stormed the room. Chaos erupted immediately, shouts, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the deafening thud of footsteps on concrete. Thomas stayed focused, moving swiftly through the chaos, relying on Coda's signals and his own finely honed instincts. At one point, a figure lunged from the shadows, a weapon raised, but Coda was faster. He leapt, taking the man to the ground in a single powerful motion. The suspect cried out as Coda pinned him, his growl low and menacing. "Hold, Coda," Thomas commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. He moved in quickly, securing the man's weapon and pulling him into custody. The room was clear within minutes, the suspect subdued and the evidence recovered. As the dust settled, Thomas knelt beside Coda, running a hand through the dog's fur. "We did it, buddy," he said softly, a rare smile breaking across his face. Back at the precinct, hours later, Captain Harris met them with a clap on the shoulder. "Hell of a job, Reed," he said. But it wasn't Harris's approval Thomas thought of as he sat with Coda that night. It was the image of Judge Hensley watching from his bench, forced to acknowledge what he had doubted. Thomas didn't need to hear it to know the truth. He and Coda had proven themselves again. Did this story move you? Show your support by sending a super sticker. Your contribution helps bring more incredible stories like this one. Thank you for watching.